For over a century, a secluded family in the mountains of Mexico was ravaged by mysterious illnesses. Children were born with ailments local healers couldn't name, and infant mortality was a constant shadow. It wasn't a curse, but a secret kept in their very blood, so disturbing it defies comprehension. In the remote and unforgiving mountains of the Sierra Madre Occidental, there is a village known on old maps as Las Almas Perdidas. There, the Morales clan was a paradox, deeply rooted in their land, yet strangely untouched by the passage of history. They were known for their striking, almost ethereal features, piercing blue eyes, and a pallor the sun never touched. But beneath this veneer, a genetic mystery was about to be exposed, revealing a truth hidden in plain sight, in the blood that ran through their veins. The unraveling began not with a confession, but with a child's persistent cough. In the late 1990s, young Alara Morales was brought to a clinic, where a newly graduated doctor noticed more than just her symptoms. He saw her unusual facial structure, slight webbing between her fingers, and bone fragility, classic markers of something deeply wrong on a genetic level. Soon after, a cousin of Alara's was treated for seizures with no apparent cause. A visiting census taker noted the alarming rate of infant mortality. They were disconnected data points, but when a curious health official began to connect the dots, a horrifying pattern emerged. The Morales family was suffering from a cascade of recessive genetic disorders at a rate that was statistically impossible. But how? What could cause such a concentrated biological disaster? The answer wasn't in a lab, but in the dusty archives of a mountain church. For Father Ignacio, who had served the region for 40 years, it all started with a name in a ledger. He had no idea he was about to unearth a horror the mountain had kept for a century. Out of curiosity, he began to trace the baptismal, marriage, and death certificates, working his way from the present into the past. At first, the pattern was subtle. Marriages between second cousins were common in isolated areas. But as he delved deeper into the 19th century, the connections grew tighter. That's when he realized the science behind the tragedy. Every human carries recessive genes for diseases, but the chances of two people with the same rare gene having a child are incredibly small. The priest, however, found records of marriages between first cousins. At this point, the probability of both parents passing on the same harmful gene to a child skyrockets. The protection of genetic diversity vanishes. Then he found the unthinkable: marriages between uncles and nieces. The shock grew with every page. The family's genealogical tree wasn't a branching structure. It was a tangled, suffocating vine, ensuring that diseases like cystic fibrosis and Tay-Sachs, documented in the children, went from a remote possibility to a tragic certainty. The bloodline, started by Mateo Morales in the mid-1800s, had become a genetic trap. We have the medical facts and the genealogical proof, but they don't explain the why. How could this suffocating vine be allowed to grow unchecked for so long? To understand what happened, we need to look at three pieces of this puzzle: geographical isolation, the power of a patriarch, and an ancient local legend. The first piece, and in some ways the most merciful, is that of deep, absolute isolation. The village was an island in the sky, cut off from the rest of Mexico. The journey to the nearest town was a 2-day trek. In this sealed environment, the pool of potential partners was drastically limited. What began as necessity may have solidified into tradition. To marry our own may have become the family's creed, a survival mechanism that protected them from outside threats, while poisoning them from within. According to this theory, there was no single villain. The family was a victim of its own geography. But does that really explain everything? Does it explain the persistence of the practice, even when its horrific results were on display with every sick child, with every small grave dug into the mountainside? This brings us to a darker theory. Was geography the only culprit? Or are we looking at the shadowy influence of a single man who shaped the fate of generations? Investigators who looked closer into the life of the patriarch, Mateo Morales heard stories from descendants of other families in the region. They painted a picture of a man of immense charisma and an unbending will, who held a near-hypnotic sway over his family. This theory posits that the incestuous unions were not a product of necessity, but a deliberate design, enforced by Mateo. It's said he believed his bloodline was uniquely pure, and that any mingling with outsiders would dilute its essence. To achieve this, he systematically arranged the marriages of his children and grandchildren. His word was law. This theory turns the tragedy from a passive consequence into an active, long-running crime, a case of abuse on a generational scale. There are whispers of a hidden diary containing his doctrines of purity. In this version, Mateo Morales is a cult leader who trapped his descendants in a cage built of their own lineage. When we examine these two puzzle pieces, the isolation theory is strong in its simplicity. Remoteness is an undeniable fact. However, it doesn't explain the intensity of the practice. On the other hand, the patriarchal control theory offers a powerful motive. The idea of Mateo Morales as a cult leader is compelling and explains why the family would ignore the devastating evidence before their eyes. They were bound by a belief system, but the evidence for this is largely anecdotal. The diary has never been found. It's possible the truth is a combination of both. Perhaps Mateo did hold beliefs about purity, and extreme isolation allowed those beliefs to fester and harden into an unbreakable doctrine. The mountain didn't just trap them physically, it created a psychological echo chamber where one man's ideas could resonate for a century. But beyond the rational explanations, the investigation uncovered another layer, a complex system of rituals and beliefs. Documented by social workers, these practices were a strange synthesis of Catholicism and paganism, centered on blood and soil. They believed their valley was sacred, and their family had been chosen as its guardians. Part of this guardianship involved keeping their bloodline unbroken. They performed ceremonies during specific lunar cycles, which they believed would cleanse the blood and protect their newborns. A tragic, superstitious response to the very diseases their practices were causing. To them, marrying a cousin or a niece wasn't a transgression, it was a sacred duty. Their children's disabilities were not a consequence, but trials of faith. This belief system created a powerful psychological defense mechanism, indoctrinating each new generation into a faith that rendered the truth of their genetic decay invisible to them. This belief system leads us to the third and final piece of the puzzle, which enters the realm of folklore. The region is rich with pre-Columbian stories, and it's possible that the patriarch Mateo Morales didn't invent his ideology from whole cloth, but rather twisted a local legend for his own purposes. One legend speaks of an ancient people who guarded a spring of immortality in the mountains. Their power, the story goes, lay in their unbroken blood, and if they were to mix with outsiders, the spring would run dry. For a man like Mateo, predisposed to grandiose ideas, such a story could have become a foundational text. He could have convinced himself and his family that they were the descendants of these mythical guardians. This folkloric explanation provides a narrative that transforms a disturbing practice into a heroic struggle to preserve a sacred heritage. The family becomes the keepers of a dying myth, sacrificing their children on the altar of a story. This leads us to an uncomfortable question. Just how powerful are the stories we tell ourselves? Here, the investigation hits a wall of silence. The truth, in its entirety, is likely lost. Of the last generation of the Morales, few survived into adulthood. Those who did were shattered by the experience. 2 of the women were placed in psychiatric care, unable to process the trauma. They speak in fragments, mixing family history with folklore, making it impossible to separate fact from delusion. One surviving male member, removed from the family as a teenager, refuses to speak of his past. He changed his name and severed all ties. The silence of the survivors is, in itself, a testament to the depth of the trauma. It tells us that what happened in Las Almas Perdidas was a horror beyond easy explanation. We can analyze the evidence, but we must respect the boundary where knowledge ends and silent suffering begins. The final chapter of the Morales family's story was not a gradual decline, but a sudden collapse. The intervention of health services in the late 1990s was the catalyst. Once the genetic evidence became undeniable, authorities moved into Las Almas Perdidas. The remaining children were taken into state custody. This act, while meant to save them, effectively shattered the family's world. The remaining adults, stripped of their children and their purpose, fell apart. The social structure that had sustained them for 5 generations, however toxic, was the only one they knew. Within a few years, a bloodline that had clung to that land for over 150 years was functionally extinct. All that was left was the story, the evidence, and the haunting question of why. As we conclude the saga of the Morales family, we must resist the temptation of a single answer. This was not a story with one villain, but a perfect storm. Geographical isolation was the crucible. Within it, the powerful ideology of a patriarch born of malice, delusion, or a twisted legend planted a poisonous seed. Finally, this system was cemented by generations of psychological conditioning and reality warping rituals. It was the interplay of all three, the place, the belief, and the people, that created a cycle of devastation. The story of the Morales family is a chilling conclusion about the dangers of absolute insularity. It is a cautionary tale, demonstrating that while traditions can provide strength, they can also become a prison when untempered by reason and compassion. The family's quest for a mythical purity led only to their complete ruin. The tale of the Morales family is a tragedy that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of family, belief, and the power of secrets. This is more than a true crime case. It's a dive into the kind of real-life horror story that proves truth can be more terrifying than fiction. What happened in the highlands of Mexico is a reminder that even in our modern world, there are still pockets of isolation where the unthinkable can take root. If investigations into the complex corners of the human experience appeal to you, consider subscribing and joining the conversation. Let us know in the comments what mystery you believe deserves a closer look.